You are listening to Talking Images, the official podcast of icmforum.com. Welcome back, everyone. I'm Chris, and in this episode, we'll try to figure out why we like the things we do. What makes a film good, bad, or mediocre? Not in general, but to us specifically. What do we respond to? What makes our taste what they are? And what even is taste? As it seems to be a bit of a mystery. I mean, no matter what the film is, be it Grown Ups, The Godfather, or John Dielman, you'll find people who loves it, and you'll find people who hate it. It doesn't matter if it was panned or beloved by critics. It doesn't matter what kind of box office success it has. It doesn't matter what kinds of rating it has on IMDb or Letterboxd. Every single film out there has at least some fans and some haters. I mean, just try it. Go to IMDb or Letterboxd. Look at any film that you thought was the most average, middling production you can remember, and you'll still find 10 out of 10 ratings on IMDb. You'll still find 5-star ratings on Letterboxd, or on the flip side, you'll find those 1 out of 10 ratings and 0.5-star ratings. They're there no matter what the film is. Sure, they'll skew one way or another, but if there's at least 1,000 votes, someone will love it, someone will hate it. Why is that? How does this taste thing work? Are there no barometers, no objective or intersubjective touch points where we can all just get together and sing Kumbaya? It seems the answer is a hard no. But again, why is that? Sure, we can probably break down film fandoms into subgroups. We can talk about escapists. We can talk about people who just want to be drawn into fantastical worlds. People with more academic sensibilities who want to interpret each and every single detail and assign meaning. There's art house and experimental fans who want to see something new, fresh, or just experience films viscerally. You have people who, are really into cult movies, B movies, and love films that are quote unquote so bad they're good. Oh, and then of course you have the old school of tradition de qualité, the kind of viewers who essentially loves everything the Academy Awards love. And there's just so many other types of film viewers out there. But even these groups disagree within themselves, and there's overlaps. Tons and tons and tons of overlaps. There just seems to be no such thing as a true template or box we can fit people into. So today we're going to open up dialogue between people with pretty damn different tastes. And we'll try to find common grounds, and hopefully each of us will manage to figure out something about ourselves, why we're drawn to the things we are drawn to, and perhaps even discover the underlying reasons why. So, got a good panel today. I got Matt back, and we got Arthur. Two hosts we hope to see much more from in the future. And I would like to start by just doing a quick benchmark test of sorts. How did you guys feel about the Adam Sandler film Grown Ups?
I'm going to have to be pretty honest here, Chris. I've not seen any Adam Sandler movies. And I think, I don't know if I can try and make a point out of that in some particular way. I think the sort of like American butt humor, very sort of low humor tend to be the types of films that I've completely avoided. So maybe that says something about my taste. I actually like Three Idiots, even though that is that sort of similar, not very intelligent type of comedy. But I need to refrain from talking too much because I've never actually watched an Adam Sandler comedy. I have, though, like, you mentioned the other end of the scale, I guess, Jeanne Dielman. I've watched that one. Maybe we discuss that in a moment.
Yeah, I can't actually blame you here because I haven't seen Grown Ups either, but I have seen a few Adam Sandler films, and it's usually not the kind of things I enjoy. So, Arthur, have you seen Grown Ups, or is this conversation a non-starter?
I don't remember anything about it. I think I've seen it right when it came out, which was maybe 15 years ago at this point. Adam Sandler in general, I find there's still a big range to lowbrow humor. His is not really for me. It's more the 90s style of lowbrow humor that's almost like borderline absurdist or surreal. That stuff I can get behind. I guess a good example would be Freddy Got Fingered, which might be even more lowbrow than Adam Sandler, but it's a complete masterpiece to me.
All right, so two people who haven't seen it, one who doesn't remember it. So we're up to an interesting start with our benchmarking exercise. But I mentioned two other movies, so I'd also like to say, like, very quickly, how did you guys feel about The Godfather?
I'm one of these terrible people that doesn't actually like the first Godfather movie. So I guess this really is, like you were saying in the introduction, about, that any movie you look at, there will be people that rate it 10 out of 10, and there will be people that rate it 1 out of 10. And even though The Godfather is meant to be this indisputable masterpiece, that I never really got to grips with it. I don't think it's a terrible film. I just think, like, straight off the sort of what I would describe as the ham acting from Marlon Brando, the sort of mothballs in the cheeks stuff just didn't kind of sit well with me. And I think a lot of the feeling, which is kind of lifted from Sconti's The Leopard, kind of just doesn't feel that authentically sort of American to me, or Italian American, and I don't hate it. And then, I again have the opinion that people often find annoying, that I really like part number 3, which I remember when we used to discuss it on the IMDb, there was a user there who was actually film director, as username I was, who used to say of Godfather 3 that it was just a made-for-TV movie that was completely without interest. But for me, it was kind of an emotional kaleidoscope, and I really liked the performance from Pacino in that one. I really liked the sort of immediate genetic family dynamics in the movie. I liked Eli Wallach coming in. There was a lot of things that I loved about that movie. So yeah, this is definitely illustrating that people have incredibly different tastes.
Yeah, and I'm actually really, really happy we somehow managed to get someone who doesn't love The Godfather on this podcast. I mean, I know there's a lot of you out there in the wild, but like with a slightly different podcast setup, it could have gone into like every single person just agreeing on The Godfather. So this makes the episode better in my mind. What about you, Arthur? Are you a fan of The Godfather?
Unlike Grown Ups, I do remember it, but again, it was a case that I haven't seen since I was a teenager. I do remember being fascinated by Al Pacino's character, how he slowly descends into being the type of character that would fit into the crime world. One scene that I still remember to this day that kind of impressed me was it was like him doing the first baptism with his kid or something like that, and it keeps cutting between that and all the murders that he planned, which it did make an interesting contrast, but it is something I'll have to watch again, that's for sure. I remember not really liking Godfather 2, which is probably just me being younger, so I have to rewatch that. Godfather 3, I hardly remember that, but I do feel like he kind of became more of an auteur later on, especially with his later works like Tetro and Twist, so I actually really be curious to go through his filmography again.
Yeah, I mean, if you're interested in seeing Coppola become more and more of an auteur, yeah, like his first you have One from the Heart, and then you kind of get his late era films. I can't wait for Megalopolis, but yeah, Tetro, Twix.
Youth Without Youth is one that I absolutely love, Chris.
Yes, me too.
Gorgeous movie.
Yes.
Absolutely gorgeous. And it's like you say that he sort of, in The Godfather, I don't know if you've read the sort of Mario Puzo books, but they are just sort of pretty straightforward transcriptions of the Puzo books on screen, in terms of the storyline. But Youth Without Youth is definitely something that comes from his heart. And I think a lot of those movies haven't really seen audiences, and a lot of them are really based on very personal topics, like his son's death, for example. And I think Tetro is one, I think it's from 2009, that's kind of pretty overlooked as well. So I'm really, you've put me in my happy place reminding me about Youth Without Youth. I just found that an absolutely glorious story in terms of atmospheres and in terms of the visuals. It's just one of those sort of dreamlike movies, and we may come on to it, but that's one type of movie I like, if you feel that you're more inside of a dream.
Right. I think that the fact that we started talking about The Godfather and we immediately start going to Youth Without Youth, which is a favorite of mine as well, I think that maybe says a little bit about where we are on the barometer already. Though I can say that I have seen Godfather several times. I love The Godfather. It is one of my favorite films, so at least there is one person who remembers and loves The Godfather as well. Though I do actually prefer One from the Heart from Coppola. So there was one more film on the barometer here, and this is a barometer I completely made up, going from Grown Up to John Dielman. There's obviously a lot of more dimensions to film, but I want to make it as quick and easy as possible. So how do you guys feel about John Dielman then? We can start with you first, Matt.
Thanks, Chris. So I've seen Jeanne Dielman pretty recently. In the last year, I've seen it twice. One, I saw it in the local cinema, one on home video. I think obviously it topped the Sight and Sound poll in 2022. So for a lot of people, it became an immediate watch. It was a film that had been sat on my shelf gathering dust for a while. Just was rather lengthy. But I think with that movie, I really like it. There are a lot of things to like about it. I think just very simple things. Like Delphine Seyrig is just so incredibly good as an actress, and incredibly captivating. I think the movie has a great sense of rhythm. It's also telling a type of story that really wouldn't have been told at the time, and not told in that way. The frustration that it would be to be a single mum bringing up a child on your own, sort of looking for income when you obviously don't have a source of that. There are just scenes that are very visually beautiful towards the end of the movie. There is this sort of scene in the dark where there are all these ripples across the wall. It's sort of reminded me of something I saw in Ozu recently. They're just very nice. So I'm a big fan of that movie. I don't know if I would necessarily put that on the sort of top of the spectrum in terms of challenging. I think I don't know if Michael Snow would go at the top, or I don't know who would go at the top. But I think it's a reasonable, maybe sort of top quartile in terms of. You would hope that people have been somewhat sensitized towards the cinema and have seen a few films before they watched it.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. I think that obviously you can put Michael Snow films above John Dielman in terms of arguable difficulties in some way, though. Then again, like you have someone like Saul, who's not really into art house, but will run and watch anything by Michael Snow because he finds him funny and light. So you never know. Tastes are very, very, very different. What about you, Arthur? What do you think about John Dielman?
It's another case that I haven't seen it for over a decade, but I do remember quite a bit of it still, and it was basically just like the subtleties of everything that was quite effective. Like as throughout the film, she's doing more of these chores that is basically routine for her, but you notice like the little cracks that are starting to break, and then obviously there's the big thing at the end. And just for like a fun fact, which could come to the evolving taste or understanding your taste, it kind of reminds me of Tobe Hooper's last movie, Jeanne, because both of them kind of show motherhood as like almost a prison in a way, and kind of funny that I'm recommending that based off of Jeanne Dielman, but yeah. That's how taste works sometimes, right?
Yeah, exactly. Makes some really interesting connections there. And I also absolutely love John Dielman. I will say, like, this is also one of those cases where it would be interesting to get just slightly different hosts. You get a completely different reaction, because I do know that, for instance, Tom, who almost was in this episode, he thought John Dielman was so dull. But I know that you, Matt, because we talked about it after you saw it at the cinema. Like, you saw, like, people were gasping when things were happening. People were completely consumed by the film, and you just had an amazing cinematic experience. So it's just so fascinating to see that even among these films that are, so well reviewed, like, John Dielman will find a lot of detractors.
Well, I think as well, this sort of comes to sort of one of the appeals of the cinema in terms of, its potential to be something magic, in that although it's a long film and I watch it, it doesn't feel long to me at all. It feels like about 45 minutes have passed. So it definitely sort of captured me within its rhythms, and I know that doesn't happen for everyone. And I think there are also like confusing issues in that there were a lot of people who were upset that it had topped the Sight and Sound poll in 2022. Schrader sort of has some rants online about conspiracy theories about people conspiring to get it to the top, and I think sometimes people confuse their annoyance or not about that subject with how much they appreciate the film. And I think it's a wonderful film, and the temptation is to sort of say, oh well, it is definitely the best film of all time. I think like where I would fall on it is that it is a very good film. Like I say, this sort of way it managed to compress time for me was very impressive. But I think a lot of the anger you see from it comes from anger at poll results, which clearly John Tarkman had nothing to do with.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the weirdest things about that poll, and we could talk about it at some point almost, or maybe in 8 years we'll do the next one if John Dielman is still there. But it's like where a lot of people said, like, this movie would have been a perfect film for like the top 10 or the top 20. We wouldn't have cared if it stayed. I don't remember exactly where it was. I think it was like number 20 or something like that last time around. It's like it would have been perfectly fair to have it there, have it go up a bit, but that far up. But it's ridiculous. And essentially, like, to be on that list, you have to have people put it among their 10 choices. So essentially, people saying it would be perfectly normal for 50 or 100 people to have it their top 10 picks. But 300, no, that's impossible. Like, it's just essentially it goes into who you pick and who you choose. And I think John Dielman is one of those films that are also so singular that it makes sense that so many people absolutely love it and put it that high, because it is one of those not really love it or hate it films, but it's one of those films that can elicit that kind of feeling for sure. Like, some people have really strong reactions against it, and a lot of people have really strong feelings just, wow, that was incredible. I haven't seen anything like that before.
Yeah, like even before it was placed at number one for the Sight and Sound list, it was kind of considered one of the more essential, I wouldn't say experimental, but sort of like starting to delve into that area. So I could see it almost a life-changing experience for many people, and that would explain its high ranking in the Sight and Sound list. And I think I remember Paul Schrader was also one of the people that like called out, well, a conspiracy theory for it being number one. His Facebook profile is definitely amusing.
Yeah, that was really odd. And obviously, I think Schrader actually said that they were counting the votes incorrectly, but every ballot has been posted, so that was definitely not the case. That was just really weird. But I think we can move on from John Dielman. But just because, Matt, you gave it the film 10 out of 10, right?
Yeah, I did. Yeah.
Yeah, because you were saying very good, so 10 out of 10 is not like it's more than just very good for you. But yeah, no. So that I think that this kind of has set the tone of where we're going. Then, so in terms of tastes, like Matt is definitely placing himself more on the I guess we could say difficult or art house scale. I'm there as well, though a little bit further down. And then we have Arthur, who's still a bit of a question mark because he saw all of these films 10, 15 plus years ago and barely remembers them. So we'll learn more about Arthur as we skip along.
So something that I would say about that, Chris, is I don't necessarily put myself at that end of the scale. So I do, if you had a look down my favourites list, there are a lot of esoteric, challenging films. But I think, I guess this will go into a conversation about evolving taste that we might have later. But I grew up watching American action movies, essentially, movies that weren't very nuanced at all. And, I didn't stop loving them because they were unchallenging or not nuanced or what have you. I felt like when I was watching a lot of very well considered, celebrated American cinema, in the sort of mass mainstream, that I somehow had a stone in my shoe, that there was something about the movie that in retrospect, when I was thinking about it a few hours later, didn't sit well with me. I think a lot of what being a film fan is about is coming to more of an awareness of what was that stone in your shoe. And I think, like, I often felt, that a lot of films particularly were glorifying reactionary violence, for example, or introducing or sort of solidifying social concepts I didn't actually agree with. That doesn't mean that I have a problem with nuanced action movies. So, for example, there's French film Panique au Village, which is just a delirious action comedy animation that I wouldn't say that it's not a movie that you watch in profundity. It's just a sheer joy. So I think part of what has been going on with me is just moving away from movies where I felt that there were deep problems with the implied values that they contained, rather than I was worried because they were mainstream or because they had action. I don't know if that makes sense.
I kind of do agree with you, especially a lot of action films also have like propagandistic aspects to them. I find that with the 80s, it's kind of not really dated, but the Cold War is over, so it was more fun to watch than anything. But for example, you see a lot of Indian action movies now, considering political hostility between them and Pakistan. It can be pretty awkward to watch. But for me, with action films, I'm actually going into them quite a bit now. I find that they kind of have to go into either the complete trashy direction, something like Andy Sidaris or PM Entertainment. They just go low budget and just aim for as many explosions as possible. But then there's kind of stuff that are almost subversive on the other side of the spectrum. There's the last Universal Soldier film. I think it's called Day of Reckoning. And yeah, it's almost like a deconstruction of action movies in a way. Because like, if you think about it, a lot of the action fight scenes are really brutal, but most action films kind of brush over that. This is like, no, action films are super violent, and I'm just going to emphasize on that. And yeah, honestly, a fantastic film that kind of borders on being horror because of the violence.
I think if people were to take nothing else away from this episode, it's to go and watch Universal Soldier Day of Reckoning. So I think it is a mini forum classic, and it's a very beautiful movie. It just occurred to me as well, I gave an example of Panique au Village. Like, I also really, really, really enjoyed Mission Impossible: Dead Reckoning Part 1. Part 2 still yet to come out, I believe, but that was the movie that I gave 10 out of 10 to, and that is a sort of pedal to the metal action movie that's in the mainstream. But one of the things that I really liked about it was just how many amazing actors they had in the movie. They brought people back. They just had a ton of amazing characters there, and it was also surprisingly emotional and mature. The way they were interacting with each other and their sort of overall philosophies on life. So it's definitely possible to have an action movie which really is just about the thrills and driving a motorcycle off a cliff, and someone like myself who's been watching films for forever and has seriously gone too far with it, that we can still enjoy those types of movies as long as there's not a sort of far right subtext trying to worm its way in.
Yeah, the other thing with action films for me is when they attempt at doing pathos or any sort of drama, they honestly fail most of the time, especially in the 90s. So that's why I prefer the more trashy kind, or just like, no, we're not going to do that, or just some quick death scene or something. We're just going to focus on as much action as possible, which makes it a lot more fun to me.
Well, first of all, I haven't seen Universal Dead Reckoning, so I guess I need to follow up on this takeaway and watch that movie, and maybe we'll come back and do an episode on it or something, because like I keep seeing people praising that film from places you wouldn't expect, and apparently it is something truly special. So fine, you convinced me. I'll go ahead and watch that film very, very soon. And yeah, no, I'm usually not drawn to full-on action films anymore, but there are obvious exceptions. I think that one of the clearest examples that, films can break that mold has to be like Mad Max Fury Road, for instance. I mean, first of all, I thought that was a great film. Not one of my absolute favorites of the year, but so many people did. Like, that's one of those, like, people always say you cannot make a spectacular action film, but critic after critic after critic essentially went out of their way to say that's one of the best films of the year, it's one of the best films of the decade, and that film is probably going to be one of the huge classics of this century. That seems very, very, very likely. And yes, I'm also drawn in by just these crazy, wacky action films. Sometimes, like, I'm a huge fan of Epoch of Murder Madness, for instance, the Okamoto film from the 60s. So throwing out that reference there too for anyone who wants a crazy action comedy, that's definitely something you should seek out. And one point where I do actually, I guess, have a different opinion with you guys is that, as I think I pointed out in a few previous episodes too, like, I don't really watch movies through moral lenses. Like, it can impact it. Like, if you have films with very severe propaganda elements, that's probably going to be a minus, but it's not necessarily because of the propaganda. It's just because it's very hard to do propaganda right. Like, I absolutely love some of these, like, Dziga Vertov style Soviet propaganda from the 20s. And I am actually a big fan of the 40s adaptation of Ayn Rand's The Fountainhead as well, because when you can get propaganda to that kind of ridiculous extreme, it can be really interesting to watch and just fun. It's like this weird special place. But usually, like, if a film adds in lots of these heavy-handed propaganda elements that so many US action films do, so many bloody Chinese action films do. Like, I think it was the Yimou Shang film from 1 or 2 years ago. I'm missing the name at the moment, where, it ends with a patriotic poem being read up and extremely loud patriotic music, and I just wanted to pull my hair out. Like, when you go to that extreme, unless it's tongue-in-cheek, then you lose me. You have to go really over the top, like that the Nail in the Boot film by
I was just about to mention that one.
Yeah.
I was just about to mention Mikhail Kalatozov's Nail in the Boot, because that is a movie that I really love. In terms of propaganda, it's so extreme and so far out of order. It's sort of Robespierrean, pure Stalinist sort of rhetoric in that. But what I would say about that is that it's very clear that is what it is. And it is also done in a very good way. So I think what I'm mostly objecting to is films where, I remember when I was a kid, if my mum had to sort of feed me a very bitter tasting pill, she put it in some ice cream, and it sort of feels like someone's messing around with your food sometimes watching American movies from the 80s and 90s, which is what I grew up with, that there are values in there that they're not making explicit whatsoever. You're kind of just getting drip-fed soft power essentially.
Yeah, the Indian action film I was talking about was Pathan, which is by SRK, and like the action is absolutely top-notch, but the thing that made it uncomfortable was that we know what's going on with India and Pakistan now, so seeing a film that's full-on going like Pakistan's the enemy, we have to take them down, it kind of left a sour taste in my mouth.
Yeah, and there are these films as well where it's like, on the face of it, it's completely innocuous, but then you realize, hey, this was going on in the real world at that point in time, and you realize, oh wait, they're really trying to rub in something, like some really, really uncomfortable brainwashing going on. Like, you can see that in some of the French movies that were produced during the occupation, for instance, where the Nazis essentially went in and said, oh yeah, you need to make this villain Jewish, you need to do X, Y, Z. That kind of thing. And like, if it was a Jewish villain in the 1960s, like, no one would bat an eye. But when you have it in the 40s in an occupied territory by the Nazis, for instance, and you realize, oh yeah, damn, that's this is some really heavy-handed propaganda that you wouldn't even realize would be propaganda in a different time, because sometimes they really can be that, how you put it, that subtle.
I think that's why I've just been reminded of another movie from this conversation. I don't know if you guys have seen this. I think it was a movie that had been discussed on our forums at some points and had been built into the ICM Film Forum Film Festival, or an earlier sort of version of it. It's this movie called Omar by Hani Abu Assad from 2013. So it's basically a movie that's is set in Israel Palestine. Is essentially, it's about a young man who's fighting against the IDF, but it's a movie that I've never really heard anybody complaining about. It's like quite highly rated on the IMDb. It's got 7.5, and it's clearly you are seeing it from viewpoint of a Palestinian, but really it's something that's incredibly well made as an action movie and as a thriller, and it doesn't try and shove a lot of politics in your face. So I definitely think you can do something about an incredibly controversial conflict that yet still isn't particularly upsetting to people.
I didn't actually see that movie, so I can't comment on it. That would probably not go down well today, but yes, I can see why, especially in 2013, that people wouldn't be that up in arms about it. So yeah, that's definitely interesting.
That conflict has been controversial forever, mate. It's
oh yes, yes.
I'm in Bristol, and there's been protests about that conflict going on sort of very near my flat for about 50 years. I obviously sort of haven't even been alive for 50 years, but I know that the protests they've been happening now every Friday afternoon for 50 years. So it was definitely, that 2013 wasn't, I don't think it was a good year for that movie to be dropped.
That's true. What interesting soundscape you must have around your apartment.
I'm very much in the center of town, so I've actually had Greta Thunberg come here with what was it? It was the school strike essentially. So she actually came here. I think it was during COVID. So yeah, lots goes on nearby. Yeah.
Maybe we had a really interesting, not quite diversion, because it's really relevant to our taste in terms of how we respond to propaganda, and just a lot of talk about fun, action, and how we respond to the messaging in that. So we might even come back to that a little bit later, but I'd like to change the topic a little bit and just ask some preliminary questions around just how well we know ourselves. And I guess the first question there would be, do you personally think you know your own taste? I mean, is it fairly easy for you to predict what you like before you see it, or is it more like you're constantly going in blind and you have no idea how you will react until you're there experiencing it in person?
I'm quite happy to speak to that. Arthur, don't let me carry on answering questions first, though, if you feel you have good answers to these questions. So I think in terms of how well do I know myself, like I like to think that it's like if you see sort of watching movies as some sort of like athletic sort of capability, like I do tend to, I'm much more likely to be watching a film that I'm going to enjoy than a lot of other film fans I know. So I feel like I have quite a high hit rate. I feel like I often read about a movie beforehand to see, are there things in there that I will like? But I do think, like, in terms of, what is my taste, there are so many different sort of things that it could be that would make me like a movie. So I guess it's not a short answer, but I don't know if you guys have watched Cocteau's movie of Orpheus. I think it's like a pretty famous movie, at least amongst us film fans. But the central character in it, who's essentially in this Orpheus role, he's a popular singer, but there's a sort of Café des Artistes, that he often walks past, where all the young people there absolutely despise him, even though he's this very successful artist. And because he just sings the type of love songs that everyone wants to hear, really sort of easy stuff. And he sort of asks them what they want of him, and someone replies back, "Étonnez-nous," which means astonish us. And really, that's a lot of what I want going into a movie. I want to feel that someone's ambitious, that they really are trying to say things that haven't been said before, or that they're going to be using techniques like nobody has ever done before, and that I'm going to be astonished. So, I think there's like a ton of different things that I can talk about here. But for example, if it's just a sort of word search, like the word ambitious is something that often sort of suggests to me that I really will like a movie, even though film critics often use it as a sort of like a damn with a faint compliment. They're suggesting that the film is trying to do things but not quite getting there. But even with that in mind, ambitious is something that I like, and I think, but for whatever reason, I've also often looking for the word haunting. There's some sort of emotional damage being uncovered. But I'll let you guys have a chat about what sort of things you're looking for. I could definitely monologue it myself for about an hour.
Going into something is not really something I can predict, but I do have the stuff that I'm drawn towards. The thing is, though, by default, I look at something by their strengths and then go from there. Like if it's something that's only focusing on style, I'm not going to care about the lack of substance part. Or if it's something surreal, I want to see my attempts to either analyze it or just see how good of an atmosphere it has and just brush any sort of attempts of logic out the window. But the things I tend to be drawn towards the most, especially when I was younger, was the more experimental stuff because, like Chris says, it does give a visceral and almost kind of emotional reaction. I'd kind of say that my favorite film of all time now might be At the Horizon, which is kind of like a duo work. One guy kind of does like the bracket style stuff, and then there's someone else that puts like a bunch of lines and vectors on there. I know it sounds kind of simple, but they actually managed to fit kind of a narrative into that with all the chaos going on with that and the music. And I was like bawling my eyes out at some point, which, considering that was just brackage with a few graphs and stuff, it's kind of phenomenal. And for like trashy cinema, especially horrors, I find that because they can be super low budget and the content doesn't really matter, I find that there's kind of more, not necessarily outsider artists, but ones that just care about ambition and they don't let anything stop them. So kind of the most self-indulgent in a good way, if that makes sense, and the more avant-garde and personal works kind of fall into that genre. So that's kind of the stuff I've been exploring these days.
Yeah, that's really interesting. For me, I would say that I think at this point I know myself fairly well. Like every single year, I make a watch list of the films that I want to see, usually based on the directors I love, what type of movie are they doing now, what kind of buzz have they gotten elsewhere, and what are critics saying about them. And just kind of mix that up, and then I will adjust it later as, more reviews come in, the ratings come in, and usually, like, there's always some surprises. There are films that go into with low expectations and they blow me away. But usually, like, majority of those films that picked at the top are films that at the very least like. And additionally, like, I would say that, like, if I have a top 20 of what I really want to see from a year, 5 of those will usually end up in my top 10. So I think I can more or less predict what I like. But like both of you guys, like, there's definitely different things that draws me to cinema. So it's not like it's going to be all either art house or, really fun comedies or, heartbreaking documentaries, like really dark thrillers. It could be anything that's there. Like there's a lot of different things I am personally drawn to, but I know more or less what I like and I know what I want from those genres. And I definitely echo, I think what both of you guys said is that if, it's a film that's all about the style, I am not going to go in there expecting context or interpretation. If it's, a acting-driven and dialogue-driven drama, I don't necessarily need visual pizzazz to love it. Though I do think that I know, in fact, that I am a much more visual-driven person than I am, for instance, dialogue or narrative-driven. I know that if a film has glorious visuals, it has to do something extremely wrong for me not to, at the very least, like it. It has to mess up on the acting. It has to have terrible storytelling, like that gnaws at me for it to fail. So essentially, if you have the most basic, adequate story in the world, but you shoot it with so much, creativity, visual angles, long takes, good performances, etc., or you can even maybe adequate performances as well, just shot brilliantly and very great atmosphere, I'll at least like that, possibly even love it. So I know I'm more visual driven, but I can definitely sit down and I can see a dialogue driven film and I love it. It's just those films that usually need to do much, much more to grab me. And I also think that as I've gotten older, just going in on style, like it has to be all out style in that case. I will need something else there. So these things that are, okay, I'm just going to do one thing. Like this is an acting vehicle for this great actor, or this is play adaptation. Like we just want to amplify the spoken word. Like they have to do something absolutely incredible to fully win me over, because if they're lacking on the attributes that I'm more drawn to, especially, it's not gonna be a top favorite. At least you need a few different things usually for me, or it has to do one thing so brilliantly to such an extreme that it becomes almost like a singular experience. So that's
Chris,
my view.
So, Chris, can I've got a question for Arthur and I've got a question for you. I think if you look at like a list of films, say like the American Society of Cinematographers, their list of milestones of cinematography, like you said that you like visual lists, is that something that you would just go down that list and you would be like, I like every single film on that list? Is the sort of visuals conquer everything else?
Was this the AFI list?
The ASC. The ASC, so American Society of Cinematographers. Yeah. I think it's official on ICM, which is why. It's one of those lists that it's a sort of Lawrence of Arabia type stuff. It's Citizen Kane, Godfather, Metropolis. They're not all like super massive films. I think there's a couple in there where you look at them and you say, there's a movie, 1984 movie called The Natural. Which is in there, which is much more obscure than any of the others. But yeah, it's those sort of big, widescreen, very famous cinematographer type movies. Is that the type of movie that you would like?
Not fully. So I have the list here now. I sorted it by ratings, and there are actually I like or love pretty much all of it. I mean, I think I've seen everything on it, and I actually think, let me see, everything but 15 I rated 8 or higher. So yeah, it's it's definitely in that area, and almost everything is on the like scale, though I did not love or like Being There. We did a podcast on that film where I was more of an 8-sayer. That's still a pretty decent film. It's just that I cannot get over Peter Sellers' performance in that. So that's one of those times where something just really drags it down. And I also didn't care for The Black Stallion very much, but I don't remember a thing about it. So yeah, definitely, like if you have something that's breathtaking, I guess I am very, very, very likely to like it. But at the same time, like looking at that list, these aren't really the films that I would think are the most beautiful films of all time. So I'm usually like you said, these are like the mainly very standard, like American and British big screen experiences. There's some exceptions there, but
I think they're all guys as well. I think every single film has a male cinematographer. Like I haven't gone through and forensically checked that, but
no, I mean,
I've gone up and down it about 4 or 5 times. I'm pretty sure that they're all guys, and
yeah, I mean, I was just going to say, like, by Beth Mangold, who shot, obviously she shot John Dielman, but she directed films on her own, and she shot several of the early films of Yvonne Rainer as well. I mean, she's absolutely exceptional, and like those kind, like her black and white photography is absolutely phenomenal, particularly. So it's just weird, for instance, they wouldn't have anything shot by Beth Mangold there. Or I don't even think like they have. Like I'm scrolling here, like do they have Soy Cuba? Because Soy Cuba is probably the most impressively shot film of all time. That more with camera movements than perhaps just the visuals, but that's still cinematography. I don't.
No, it is in there.
Oh, it is. Okay, I see Soy Cuba now. Good, there I found it. So yeah, that would have been insane if that wasn't there.
Looking through the list as a whole, though, it's kind of more like technical cinematography, if that makes sense, as opposed to stylized. They all seem pretty good for the most part. Just the only one I would say would be more on the style end of the spectrum would be The Matrix, especially with its color grading. Maybe one day, if we can find more lists to adopt, there might be like the more stylized cinematography or color grading kind of lists.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I was just going to say, like, I don't see anything directed by Robert Grillet, for instance, like Eden and After. Like, I mean, and not some people might be, complain about some of the content there, but like Eden and After is possibly like at least top 5 best shot color films. So, like, yeah, it has a very, with a few exceptions, it's like a very, very, very like blockbuster beauty, rather than something extremely visceral and more experimental, if you will, because those, like, they have Last Year of Marienbad here, very, very well deserved, obviously, but I would say that I'm leaning more towards like Last Year of Marienbad, or even just like visually dreamy films, like doesn't have to be Tarkovsky, but like I just saw like a week ago, I saw Leda Linus's Werewolf, the 1968 movie. It's one of the best regarded films in Estonia, but it's not really gotten a great reputation outside of Estonia. And it's not just the pure visuals, like it needs a Blu-ray restoration, but you can tell like the way it cuts, the way the camera tracks around the forest. It's like pretty almost like seeing Tarkovsky plus a little bit of extra dreamlikeness. Like that kind of visuals, especially when intercut with, or that pun almost, like when matched with great editing. So you make everything like into a very visceral dance, and you drawn in. That's like an experience I absolutely love. Like I think, I don't remember who said it, but it was someone who, famous at the very least, who said that they wished films were more like music than novels or plays, and I'm definitely in that camp as well. Like if your visuals can be part of like this grand composition where you feel like you're just moving through the film, I'm very, very, very likely to respond to it.
I think I used to make this very, very sort of highfalutin phrase. I think it was Wagner had this term Gesamtkunstwerk, like a total sort of artwork where you are really drawing in the best of all the art forms. And the suggestion is that maybe film is the best able to do that. Whilst he thought it was opera, like clearly, if you have a camera, you can, and you have editing, you can do even more with an opera potentially. I hope I'm not offending anyone who's listening. It's big up. I had a question for Arthur, which I'm just going to go back with, and the segue, I guess, is that it's kind of a no cinematographer movie, if I'm right. So I think, Arthur, you mentioned that Horizon. Is that the Manuel Knapp and Takashi Makino movie?
Oh yeah, it is that one. He does a lot of the stuff where it is pretty much brackish, like the Mike guy, but he aims a lot more for actually an atmosphere, I guess you could say, as opposed to brackish. Like the obvious thing is adding music on top of it, and At the Horizon had kind of movements with its music that even changes genre sometimes, like kind of a techno opening, some classical later on into it, and then when it all turns to chaos, it's just noise for a bit, and it just had that very visceral combination with caring about both audio and visual.
There are actually filmmakers that I follow and I'm really interested in. I think, Knapp particularly. Knapp also does, or at least he has done in the past, paintings. I keep on trying to buy an old painting of his that is this sort of glorious piece of exploration of black and white and contour and things like that. But one of my favorite movies of all time is called The Prospect of Doom, which is literally just 2 hours of computer generated images, which is someone looking out over this vast space where very sort of strange geometrical things are going on. So I'm trying to sort of dive down into why has my taste sort of led me, and why has others taste.
Have you recommended this film to Saul?
Yeah, this would be an apps. This sort of stuff, like anything that Makino, anything that Knapp had done, would be absolute soul killers. So yeah, I don't know if we have mirror tastes. Sol is also very keen on documentary, and I think actually like with documentary is interesting to me because, when I think about what I'm interested in about film, what draws me to film, I've always had this feeling. And some of it's, backed up by experiences that have been happening through my life, that generally when people are untruthful, that they say things that are very different from how they act, or, when you're getting brought up from a child, you're sort of fed a load of values that the people that are telling them you that they don't actually believe, that you find out that people are sort of leading double or even sort of triple lives. Now, obviously, that wouldn't have happened to everyone when they're growing up. But I think one of the things that I've always been looking for is some sort of deeper way at getting to the truth, which, clearly is problematic via film. Like various people have made statements about, film either being truth at 24 frames a second or, lies at 24 frames a second. But that actually I felt there's often such a disconnect between, these sort of liminal truths, deep truths and ways of being, and the way that people actually talk, that documentary just isn't up to the task of uncovering that, and maybe much more extravagant sort of fictional films can get there. So maybe there's a particular film, for example, that's in my top 10 films of all time. It's called The Desert of the Tartars, film by an Italian filmmaker called Valerio Zerlini. It's based off an amazing novel by Dino Buzzati. Really, that movie's all about a bunch of soldiers who have to guard a fort at a frontier in the sort of middle of nowhere, and they just sort of don't really have anything to do but seem to be subject to absurd levels of discipline. And the whole thing, to me, when I watched it, felt like watching like an allegory of a lot of the way that I see people living their lives, and so some of me in there as well. But exactly how you would get at a truth like that through a documentary, I don't really know. So that's part of the way I'm very different from Sol. Is he's into sort of documentary as this way of investigating truth, where I'm really looking at very different ways that people might be trying to do that. I don't know if either of you guys feel the same, that you're sort of trying to, use cinema as some sort of investigative tool, or, whether it's not really that for you at all.
I find that it kind of goes more into a later episode that will do Evolving Taste. But now that I have much more media literacy, I find that kind of trying to figure out a film is solving a puzzle in a way, and that can be quite fun to me. Even if like my interpretation of it is completely different from the director's, it's still quite fun. And I kind of made it a challenge upon myself with a director who I mentioned the last time. The guy was considered like one of the worst directors ever, David Dakota, and just trying to like find some deeper meaning to it is honestly some of the most fun I've had.
So that's something that you're very interested in as well, right? Film as a sort of a puzzle?
Yeah, I'd say so. I also care more about people now, finally. Like I was drawn towards experimental films back then because I was kind of the more anti-person nihilist. I was just living on the internet. But now that I'm at least trying to have an effort of more of a social life and caring more about the psychology of people, I kind of am drawn towards that too. It's kind of based off of real life events as well. And just on top of getting older, one example I could think of is like Mekas, because a lot of his films are based off of memories. I didn't enjoy them when I was younger, but I think I should give them another shot now that I'm 33 years old, because with that sense of nostalgia and family and all that, his films might be a lot more effective to me.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. And we should definitely save that conversation for our upcoming episodes about how our tastes have evolved over the years. But to give one tidbit about me as well, one of the main ways that I have changed, and I'll speak a bit more about this in the upcoming episode, is that I used to only really care about the technical aspects of a film. Is the film technically beautiful? Is it well composed? Not having beautiful visuals would be an instant negative for me. I wouldn't necessarily hate it, but it would be minus marks. But over time, I have actually started to learn to appreciate films that are purposefully not perfect, and started appreciating films that are beautiful in their own ways, essentially, films that find their own bold expressions. I guess it's one of those things you say that it's a scale, essentially, and I think that when you have, obviously you can do a mainstream movie and you can shoot it mediocrity or poorly, and it's just flat and boring. But if you take it to a certain extreme of minimalism or amateurism, there can be something really, really exciting that comes through that. So today I very much enjoy Dogma. I very much enjoy the Brazilian movement, Cinema Marginal, which like really cut things to the bone, and it just feels really, really cool and fresh when they do that. And even stuff like a Cuban Fight Against Demons, for instance, by Alea, like that's also a favorite of mine. So I really started to like films that also embraces not perfect visuals. I think that can be a really, really cool expression in itself. So that's definitely a part of my taste now. I mean, that's even some of the things with like Bresson and certain minimalism. Like the first time I watched Lancelot du Lac, like some of just how the film looked was a big negative to me. Now it's like a huge positive, and it's why it's one of my top favorites. So I think it's just because it's not just about visuals for me. I just really, really like films that do something with the visuals instead, if that makes sense. To answer, I think there's a few points I brought up. So Matt asked if we are drawn to film as kind of an investigative tool.
Yeah, an investigation of reality, essentially. Do you think it can do that, even via fiction?
Oh, do I think I can do it, or is that one of the reasons I watch films?
Is it one of the reasons that you watch film?
I would probably say no. It's not one of the reasons I specifically watch films. I mean, it can be a draw to a specific film if it's set in time or culture that I don't know much about. And it's certainly one of those things. I think that when you see a lot of films from around the world, a lot of perceptions and prejudices can definitely go away, or they can become more accurate. You can just see how people are talking about themselves or showing themselves. That can tell you so much. So it's definitely interesting, and it can be one of the reasons I specifically seek out a film, but I don't think it's one of the main reasons why I'm drawn to cinema in general. I would say that the reason why I'm drawn to cinema is because I want intriguing visual experiences, essentially, for whichever reason. So that reason can be, it's something like you talked about with the experimental films where it's all visceral. Or it can be like just a fun narrative that exists for its own. It can be someone playing around with genre conventions. It can be anything. So I would say I'm more in the scale of I'm watching this because I'm enjoying it and I'm engrossed and entertained. I can be engrossed by completely different reasons. And I can also see films beyond those reasons. Like I can be drawn to something specifically because I might learn something from it, or because it's going to say something interesting about that time or that era. I'm going to learn something from it. But that's not the main reason I'm watching it. It's same with documentaries. Like we had a episode about why Tom dislikes, or I think that's what called why Tom hates documentaries. It turned out he's just mostly disinterested in them. And in that episode, I said that, I can be really interested in the topic, but it doesn't mean that I love that documentary. I don't watch documentaries to learn about the topic. I watch documentaries specifically because of the visual journey it can take me on. Like, I care about its narrative, I care about its visuals, I care about, like, in terms of what I'm appreciating about documentaries, it's the exact same thing I appreciate about a feature film. But then you have those other things on the side, like it can be investigative, it can expose things, but if that exposure, what it uncovers, is not done in a visually interesting way or a way that works as cinema, that's going to get lower points for me rating wise. I might really enjoy the learning I'm getting from it and appreciate it that way, but I see those things as separate for me. So the interest in learning and the interest in enjoying cinema are two very different things for me.
Yeah, I didn't hear the episode yet, but like thinking of a documentary filmmaker that does that, the obvious one is Frederick Wiseman. Like his landscape shots before every scene set up. It's not only like visually beautiful, but it's just edited perfectly. And the way he actually kind of makes a narrative based off of a simple topic, like a welfare office or something like that. As a film, they're very impressive. Like he's one of my favorite directors easily.
Yeah, and I mean, like some of the I had two documentaries in my top 5 when we did Best Films of 2022 episode, which was like my number one was Four Daughters, which includes like a lot of meta storytelling. They like you have actors playing the daughters that were lost. I'm not going to get into that movie, but it becomes a very artificial thing and about the creation of it and about reliving the memories. So that's all things I enjoy in fiction as well. So that was absolutely fantastic. And the other one was Orlando, my political biography, which also, like, it's visual. It mixes meta, it mixes an adaptation with Orlando with real interviews, and it plays around with reality so much that it's more poetical. I think that I'm really drawn to essay films in general. I'm really drawn to documentaries that can kind of just capture something beautiful or ugly or just visually or artistically interesting. Like, if it's not artistically interesting, if it's just a retelling of facts, then that's perfectly fine. I can enjoy that, but it's not what I go to the cinema for or watch a film for.
Can I ask you a follow-up question to that, Chris? Because there's a film that I know that you really love that I love as well. It's Die Parallelstraße, The Parallel Street by Ferdinand Kittel. So, sorry to the audience that we're sort of veering into a very obscure movie here, but this was kind of one-hit wonder from a guy who usually made essentially films for corporates, but he made this sort of stunningly strange and very different movie called the Parallel Street. But Chris, I always saw that movie as being something that was very reflective of a philosophy about life, that life is this sort of confusing event that happens to us, that we spend at parts of our time a lot of time trying to figure out what on earth is going on here and why, and that seems it to be that something that was incredibly well captured by that movie. So again, I'm going to test you to see, would you agree with that, or with the different things that you were getting from that movie?
Oh yeah, absolutely. So like I said, if you can make something poetical, if you can induce meaning into it, that's absolutely fantastic. I love that. I think that can elevate something. And yes, the Parallel Street is, I'm not sure if Kafkaesque is the right word, but obviously you have that bureaucracy. You have essentially this group of people that trying to assemble a range of images and index them and like make something cohesive of what they're seeing. But they don't really have enough time, and if I remember, like, they're going to get killed if they don't succeed, and it's a futile task, and they're just sitting at this table trying to make sense of it, and then we flash through all of these different things they're seeing. Yes, I mean, it's essentially this kind of existentialism where you could say that you cannot make sense of life in a way that's definitely a very good interpretation. And it's a really haunting film in large part because of it, but it's obviously also beautifully shot and composed. Like I mentioned, Orlando. Like, Orlando is a film that goes really deep into the trans non-binary experience. You have trans people interviewed. They're playing Orlando, who many of these people see as like they identify with Orlando because that's someone who changes their sex in this 100-year-old story. And they're playing Orlando, they're playing scenes from Orlando that are being interviewed as Orlando, and they slip into their own self, and it becomes this thing that I learned a lot about trans non-binary people from that film, because I can see plurality of opinions. Like, I learned, for instance, that there's plenty of people who are on that scale who don't actually even want to pass, but want to maybe pass as trans, but they don't want to pass as like a cis woman or a cis man, for instance. You had lots of variety. You had people who would never want to transition, but be in this kind of like this non-binary or a different form of gender expression. And it just that was really, really interesting. And I loved exploring and learning about that. And at the same time, it's done in this beautifully poetic way that gives us a lot of gravitas to it all. So yeah, like, if you can infuse learning and if you can infuse meaning and things that say, I guess, yes, absolutely, say something about the human condition into a piece of art, that just makes it stronger. But if it's something you can just write on a piece of paper and it's shot in and done in a way that feels like a news report or a university lecture, that's probably not going to appeal to me as art. I might still really be interested, because I do read nonfiction, I do watch the news, etc., and I've learned a lot about it and I appreciate it a lot. But I just feel like that's something separate from art and what I look for in art.
And so just to be clear, we're not talking here about the very famous sort of Sally Potter movie from the 90s. We're talking about just in case people aren't aware, it's not actually been released yet in the UK. I don't think it's, I've seen trailers for it in cinema here, but this is more of a documentary style thing where they get tons and tons of people together who find that story of, a character who is both male and female at different points in their lifestyle quite, meaningful to them. I think it brings me to another topic, maybe, if I can be allowed. It's about seeing yourself represented in film, that people want to go to the cinema maybe, and certainly I do, and try and find that someone else has had the same experience as me. And I think actually, like that movie Orlando, the original one, but I'm sure the one that I haven't seen yet, about to be released here, is doing much the same thing. That I've spoken to a lot of people who were moved by it and felt particular things about themselves that maybe are hard to express with the sort of language that we have nowadays. There are words like, or phrases like non-binary, genderqueer, gender fluid, all sorts of words that maybe people they can't find a word that suits them, but they do know that they have had lots of wondering about gender within themselves, which is definitely something that I can associate with. But I think there are various movies, and it'd be interesting to see if this is the same for you guys, where if you felt that there was something a bit different about you that wasn't particularly normal, but that you actually went to the cinema or you were watching it at home and you saw a movie that really connected with you. So I just mentioned one very briefly. There probably are a few, but there's an old cartoon called Ferdinand the Bull, which would have been sort of massively famous at the time. I imagine it's from the 30s, so 1938. I think it's a storybook as well. That tells you quite a lot, that parents were sort of reading the story to their child. But it's basically about a young bull. I think it's set in Spain. I think near Sevilla, something like that. The cartoon, and the bull essentially doesn't want to be like the other bulls. They sort of have a lot of fun smashing their heads against one another, but Ferdinand essentially just wants to sit there and smell flowers, and his mum's very worried about him because he's not behaving like a typical bull, and it's the humans in the movie are very worried because they can't goad him into fighting. And that's a movie that I just watched. It's actually like on ICM forum, there's a gel from that, which is my user profile icon. But that's something that I just very sort of deeply connected with and felt. And again, people might try and put that in terms that sociologists have come up with, but to me it was something that was incredibly resonant. It delivered in that sort of style of a cartoon going back as far as the 30s. So that's something that I also look for at the cinema that was very meaningful to me. I don't know if either of you guys have seen films where you felt that.
Not necessarily like a direct connection like that. I find music is much more effective for me in that aspect. But kind of topics in general, I guess you could say. In 2017, that was when my permanent mental health issues started coming in. So to kind of have more introspection, I started exploring more psychological aspects. And I guess the best summary I could say is that before I connected to Cronenberg with the body horror, and now I don't care about his body horror and care about the psychological aspects.
Oh yeah, that's an interesting flip, and that you can still enjoy it. That's really interesting. Like you just went from enjoying one part about it to another.
Question to you, Arthur, is there maybe any type of movie that isn't being made that you would like to see?
That's really tough to tell, actually. If there's like an experimental film of how it would feel, how mental health issues can be like sometimes, I would say that's good. But for example, the one that I kind of connected to the closest, which somehow ended up being made and kind of represented me, was the latest work by Neil Breen, which is called Cade's Crossing. But that was honestly just sad because it was honestly clearly a case of someone going through a psychotic episode and making a film during it. It's something I would recommend to see someone actually made something like that, and this is how it feels like to go through it. But at the same time, it shouldn't have been made, really. He should have just had help instead.
Have you by any chance seen It's Such a Beautiful Day by Don Hertzfeldt? That seems to encompass, it's one of his like stickman pieces, but it's feature length, but that goes through an absolute gamut of mental health issues that the character's going through.
I've seen that when it came out, and I remember I did the Kickstarter for the Blu-ray, which I even have like 3 or 4 frames of the film itself. But that was before, it probably goes more into evolving taste, but before that aspect of my life happened, so I think I appreciate it more now.
Well, for me to answer your question, Matt, I mean, I think I'm too cold a viewer, to be honest. I mean, there's characters that I have identified with, or situations I've identified with, but like usually, I suppose I'm just so not dispassionate, perhaps. I'm mainly viewing films through like visceral, technical, like those types of elements. So that type of direct personal connection where I'm feeling seen. Like, I don't think I've had that, to be honest. So that's a really boring answer. It's just, I can't remember a single instance where like that connection spoke out to such an extent that it had an extremely powerful reaction for me.
Yeah, that is kind of my taste. It's summarized in a very succinct way. It's even the same with music. I care much more about the emotional reaction I get from it. It doesn't necessarily have to be a direct connection to like how I am or any aspect about me, but just my emotional reaction based off of the work.
Both Matt and I kind of answered this question already. I was going to ask it later, but since it's already come up, I'd love to hear from you, Arthur. What is the main reason why you choose to watch movies? So Matt said it's because he wants to kind of investigate and learn about the world. I said essentially I want visceral experiences of various kinds. What's your main reason for watching a film?
That's a very tricky question because I don't really have a preference. It just comes down to a mood thing. If I need to see some So Bad's Good trash, I will look for that. Again, like I said, I'm drawn towards more emotional connection, but really just whatever I'm in the mood for.
I think, like, if I may, I'll just like there are other. So you did pick up on the I guess the key reason that I'm watching films. I guess there are other ones though. I think something that is very different about movies that people don't know if they'd reflect that they sort of realize this, or maybe they realized it if I said it, is that the whole point about movie actors is that they're incredibly expressive. So when you watch a movie, if someone's upset, you know it. They really are showing it in their face. Whereas actually in real life, that's not necessarily the case. You can find out much later after an event that someone was feeling a completely different way from what you actually thought they were. So I think I grew up on the autistic spectrum. I sort of got diagnosed with that at about age 2, and it was all, I think, particularly at school, I had a lot of difficulties fitting in and finding friends and things like that. Is because of this, difficulty with social interaction. And I think one of the reasons that I liked watching movies, I think I had a sort of revelation watching Channel 4 in the UK used to show some incredible films, and I remember late night one night watching La Reine Margot's sort of Patrice Chéreau movie from the 90s, and I just was watching emotional detonation everywhere, which isn't what you see so much in normal life. Often people are incredibly inscrutable, whereas on the screen you can make a lot more sense sometimes out of things that are happening. So that may be a sort of very personal one for me. But I think something maybe that sort of, may be more resonant more widely is this sort of idea that cinema might be kind of like a magic show. There were films that I watched when I was a kid, things like Bedknobs and Broomsticks, which is this wonderful movie that combines animation with live action at the same time, and also Young Sherlock Holmes. I think it's actually, sometimes people mention it as the first sort of Hollywood movie where there's a full CGI effect. You know, I'm sure like some people that are much more interested in historical accuracy and tracing these things precisely may know earlier things, but I believe it's one of the first full CGI effects happens in that movie. And that there's a scene, I think, in Young Sherlock Holmes where young Watson is in a cemetery and he's hallucinating at night, and there's this fridge that opens up with all these cakes inside it, and suddenly the cakes start sprouting eyes and legs, and then sort of propelling themselves into his actual mouth. And it was just something that you just watch and you're like, what on earth is happening here? This is complete magic. This isn't something that can happen in any other art form, you know, where you just can really control the viewer and just show them things that are absolutely astonishing. And I think, you know, I remember reading Bergman and him making sort of statements about this sort of thing grabbing him, you know, that you could essentially play with time, and that was a sort of magic that very much appealed to him. I don't know if that would be resonant with either of you guys.
It kind of does to an extent. I find that films are the most effective in that aspect because they're just a combination of so many different aspects. Like books can only go so far with that, music can only go so far with that, and movies can combine everything with that. And speaking of what you were saying about kind of like seeing emotion a lot more, I guess, explicitly with films, there was this YouTube video that came out a few days ago that I have the exact quote right now, and they said, "For much of the early parts of film's history, death and emotional authenticity were not a big expectation," which I find to maybe be the worst quote I've ever seen. Because, like, even with silent films, I'm sure you're able to see the emotional authenticity of that. It'll help give you a reaction to that too, because they had to show it just with their face, so they really had to show it, and that's just a very effective aspect to me.
Yeah, I think if you ask if you ask Maria Falconetti about, you know, whether silent films could be expressive or not, I think the answer would be that absolutely that they can be, and you know that's still talked about. You know, her performance as Joan of Arc is still talked about as one of the great all-time performances. But I kind of get what that quote was talking about, because I do. There are some films that I see, you know, very early sort of westerns, you know, these sort of one reel westerns where, you know, they're recreating stories from the Old West. You know, people are riding on horses and shooting at each other, and those do seem like films where there's absolutely no emotion whatsoever being displayed. You know, it is very much sort of turning the handle on the action, but that is something very much that is something that I find incredibly attractive about the cinema. There's a quote, I think it's by A.O. Scott, that I'm no relation of mine, that I'm sort of rapidly looking up. Yeah, so he made this sort of comment that film exists to consecrate the human faith, which I always thought was you know, there are lots of films that don't do that, but I think that you know, that's a sentiment that I enjoy quite a lot, and hopefully it is a place where you can just see these sort of great emotional detonations happening that you tend not to see too much in modern life, I guess.
Yes, a very interesting way of saying it. And yeah, like you said earlier, like one of my reasons for watching cinema too is definitely that I want to be wowed, just like you. It's getting rarer and rarer in a way, I suppose, but like that feeling of seeing something done, like you said, like a magic trick, or just poetry, or just a visual explosion, or just, you know, some really great dialogue and acting that's put together incredibly well. Those kinds of experiences are really, really, really invigorating, and that really is the height of what the medium can do. Exactly as Arthur said, like it combines all of the main mediums that we've had throughout history. You have the ability to convert through words, like books, through the spoken word, plays, through music, through visuals, and you can just build atmospheres and combinations that would not have, and that's not possible anywhere else. And that's one of the reasons why we love films so much, I suppose. So I would be very, very interested in whether or not you guys have an instant Matt movie or an instant Arthur movie, like either that you yourself will just instantly go like, this is my kind of movie. a film that just screams your name, or a film that other co-hosts, for instance, will call an art or a Matt movie, because like we said about that one experimental recommendation you had earlier, Matt, like this would be a Saul killer. Like this is exactly what Saul would love to watch. So we've definitely talked about the Saul kind of movie already, even though it's not even in the episode. But asking you first then, Matt, is there such a thing as a Matt movie?
I think so, and I mean, I'll mention one that the forum user exclaimed to me that it was a perfect example of a Matt movie, and there's a movie by Marcel L'Herbier that was made during the World War II in France. So it's called La Nuit Fantastique, the Fantastic Night. I think you've seen this movie as well, Chris, but it's this sort of black and white movie about this character who's essentially a dreamer. He's a kind of sort of poor, sort of fairly marginal philosophy student who has to work as a porter next to a flower market, and then essentially it starts coming a romance with a character that he creates in his mind. And I think that just sort of spoke to me of several things, just that I am someone who probably can identify with being marginal, or at least at points in my life being marginal, very much being a dreamer. I'd love to spend a lot of time at university. I'm sad that people often are sad that they left because of the party life, but I'm sort of sad that I can't sort of carry on learning about stuff, in that incredibly sort of focused and guided way. And just also this idea of ideal love, something that tends to happen when you're actually with someone is that it can be disappointing, or at least it can't live up to absolutely stratospheric expectations. Whereas when it's it's all a dream. It always lives up to your expectations. And I think there are various old French movies that are like that for me. And maybe it's because those types of movies are a lot more impressionistic, and the French are a lot more concerned with love. I think I'll just very briefly mention another. This is a much rarer movie from 1936 called De Femme by Jacques Deval. And that movie is essentially about, this situation in the past, so it's in the interwar period in France, but that young unattached women would be expected to kind of live together essentially in boarding houses. And these women essentially are always trying to sneak boyfriends in. There's also been seen in there, one of the women there is very clearly in love with one of the other women, but it's very much a kind of queer film, because often, one way that you can get your boyfriend into the premises is to disguise him as a woman. So it's just this kind of very gentle film, again, like the other one I mentioned, La Nuit Fantastique. It's a very sort of gentle, sort of dreamlike movie where people can, there's not much criticism. People sort of are living ideal sort of lifestyles in a way, that love is something that is much more, open and, I don't know, polymorphic to use a posh word, but yeah, that would be sort of Matt film for me.
Wow. Yeah, that was actually completely unexpected. I was thinking you'd say something very, very different about, for instance, some kind of meaning or some kind of additional learning, but you ended up going with the lives of dreamers because you directly relate to dreamers and just this idea of people living their ideal life. That's really, really fascinating. That's the kind of movie you definitely go for. I'll keep that in mind for future recommendations.
Well, there just aren't enough of them. That's the problem. I mean, I would have a list of 1,000 of them if there was a list of 1,000.
No, I get you. Like, I'm trying to think what could come up in my mind. I'll like from now on, when I watch films, I'm gonna sit around and look at could this fit Matt? So I'll keep a lookout for you. What about you, Arthur? What would you describe as your kind of movie?
It changed really quite a bit recently. Like I said before, I prefer to more lower budget horror films now because people will still have their ambition and their fantastic ideas and they're not going to let anything stop them. There's not really any sort of censorship or stuff like that because of the genre too, and they can just do whatever they want. And there's three examples I can think of that are quite well in that aspect. One of them has the other aspect that I really enjoy, despite all of these horror stuff, which is also the investigative aspect. A good example of one that does both of these is Prom Night 2. It's seriously like a lot smarter than you'd expect to believe in a type of film like that, where it kind of deconstructs the way slashers are and like high school drama stuff, where it's basically like the old ghost possession kind of film, but you can kind of see it as like a sexual awakening for a high school student. And a lot of them can go on the other end of the spectrum, which maybe is much more my style, which is like an ethereal sort of atmosphere that's kind of helped by the bad acting. Like it just kind of rumbles into a nice low budget horror ball. There is a Canadian film called The Carpenter. It also kind of goes with investigative aspect thinking about it, but the symbolism is very obvious with it. But it's a horror film of a mentally ill woman and the husband decided to buy a new house just in the middle of nowhere to kind of give a restart in life. But then she keeps getting creeped on by like all the construction workers that are during the renovations. But then there's a carpenter at nighttime that she instantly falls in love with, and then he protects her in every way and stuff like that. And twists obviously come in later on, but that was actually incredibly atmospheric. But it kind of shows how tough it is to find films like that, because I'll post the poster in our chat room and you'll see it's just the complete opposite of what the poster actually implies. But you know how horror films are, especially in the 80s, right? The way they had to be advertised. Blaxploitation is another version of that, because a lot of them are actually more avant-garde and ethereal types of films, but they had to have been advertised in a different way, which kind of makes it a challenge to find that Arthur film, because they're either the stuff that looks like the poster I posted, or are actually the exact atmosphere that I wanted, or the emotional connection that can be caused by said atmosphere. A more recent one that I've seen, and I know it's going to piss a lot of people off, but I legit liked it, and it was Deathbed, the Bed That Eats. It was based off of a dream. Yeah, I know, exactly. But apparently it was actually based off of the director's dream, and I felt like it accomplished that dream aspect just perfectly.
Have you seen Driller Killer by any chance? I mean, I'm just looking at this poster of the Carpenter, and it's, it's a kind of here's Johnny type picture with a guy advancing with drill, like Abel Ferrara one. I don't know if that would appeal to you.
Actually, no, and I really love Ferrara too, which is really surprising. I also noticed if we're ever going to do like an episode of the lowest ratings possible, his latest film has like a 3 on IMDb, but it's a full-blown masterpiece. But I think it's because you look at the trailer, it's like they try and make it look like a full-blown political thriller, but it's like an experimental film made during COVID, so it has that really like claustrophobic intimacy to it with some very fucked up camera work. So that kind of falls into something else. Not necessarily an Arthur movie, but something I would really get that visceral reaction that I wanted.
Ferrara's one of these guys who the critics have absolutely stuck through thick and thin, whereas when you look at the ratings of some of the films that come out, they really are not there at all. Sorry, Chris, I interrupted you.
No, I was just gonna say, like, I actually really, really love the premise of That Bed, and there's some elements there that's dreamlike and crazy. I think that could have been a masterpiece, to be honest, but I ended up maybe not actually hating. I think I might have given it like a 4 or something, just because it was such a bizarre concept. But I really hated most of the technical aspects of that film, which is like I said, like I'm so driven by the visuals and technical aspects that it would have to have gone all out camp for me to absolutely love it. And I thought that was almost a little bit more, what's the word for it? It wasn't as intentional as it might have been, but who knows? So yeah, that's real interesting, Arthur. I'm so glad that we have this on the episode, that we actually get like on one side of the spectrum we have films about dreamers, on the other side we have someone just absolutely love what I think you call them trashy horror films, like trashy, bizarre, low budget horror films. Like it's just so awesome to have that contrast. Because I was a bit worried when we only had 3 hosts for this episode that we wouldn't have had the variety, but it's a very nice clash of taste. By the way, have you seen Ferret Vampire, the one about the vampire car from '82?
Surprisingly, no.
It's 5.8 on IMDb, but it's made by Uri Hurst, the guy who made the Beauty and the Beast and who made the Cremator, etc. So you might like that. Throwing out that recommendation.
Yeah, it's kind of weird looking at our differences, but they're all really artistic in a way. Like, we have the more art house aspect. For me, it's kind of not necessarily outsider art, but like you could tell it's someone with a bunch of ideas and is doing their best to try to do it, which naive art is, I think, the more formal term for that. And then there's a technical aspect for you, Chris. So we kind of click together, even though we clash together at the same
Yes,
time.
absolutely. It's so fun to hear it play out. I wasn't fully expecting that, so that's awesome. In terms of what a Chris movie is, I think some of my co-hosts have dubbed those already. They're usually like either hyper-visual or very Brechtian. So I love artifice. I know that's a big turnoff for a lot of people. I mean, that was the part of the point I was talking just now about Orlando, my political biography, or Four Daughters, artificial, meta. You can bring that into Godard, especially late era Godard. My favorite current director is Radu Jude. Like, I mean, he broke up Bad Luck Banging with like a midsection that's a video essay with like toys and artifacts and like little comical write-ups that dive into like funny, weird, experimental jokes almost. If a film just not to break the fourth wall, but if a film just embraces that it is a film, that will often make me interested right away. Not all of them are great, obviously, but like if people see a well-shot Brechtian film that just embraces that aspect of it, they usually come running to me and recommending it because it's such a good fit. And I think one of the most perfect examples of that is not actually the cold ones like Dogville or West Indies. These films are kind of all extreme. Like Dogville is this paint the houses on the floors, and it's like full on Brechtian theater where they're pretending they're opening doors, but you almost forget about it. Like, that's such a cool expression. Or you have West Indies, which is shot on a slave ship, but it also represents the island where the slaves are coming from, and like you go down under the slave deck, and that's like their houses, and it recreates that. Like, those are two of my all-time favorite films for that reason. But it doesn't have to be that cold and detached. Like, when I was younger, cold, detached, misanthropic, etc. Those would be the kind of buzzwords that would make me excited. Like, anything Sam Peckinpah, for instance, I would be running up to right away. I would be loving things just because they were cold and hateful. But you can also do it with just love and passion. So another film that really embodies the type of Christian film would also have to be something like Jane B for Agnes V. The kind of pseudo-bio documentary that Varda did of Jane Birkin, where she's essentially giving Birkin like the chance to just be whoever she wants to be, take any role she wants, and it's essentially a movie about them like creating her dream scenarios, her dream roles. And it's done with so much visual flair, it's just so much joy. Birkin plays so many different roles, there's just so many stunning visuals in it. As well as probably one of the most beautifully shot films of all time. They recreate paintings, and it's just done again with just so much love. So anything that just embraces the artificiality and magic of cinema like that would definitely be a Chris film.
How far would you go with Peckinpah, Chris? Like, presumably you've seen The Osterman Weekend.
Actually, that's the one Peckinpah I haven't seen. I think it's maybe that one and one more, but I haven't seen that one.
To me, I mean, I think it's a superb movie, but there are clear problems with it. But I think it's one that, you know, I'd ask people, you know, to see if people were really into Peckinpah. You know, do you like The Osterman Weekend? I think, by the way, there's this idea of having an episode where we chat about movies that we love that have absolutely terrible ratings is a really good one. And actually, there's a slight segue there, Chris, because when you were talking about films that that you like that would be Chris films, the film that sprung to mind for me was this French remake of Conan, you know, the Bertrand Mandico one, She is Conan. I don't know if you've seen that. I know Beavis has seen that and you know wants to get everyone watching it. because that is, again, very sort of meta, very maximal,
Yes.
very artificial, very Brechtian.
Yeah, I mean, I love Conan. I mean, I think that one had, like, it's clearly done for a very, very low budget, and some of the jokes are a little bit juvenile, but I love the style of it. I love the artifice. So yes, like anything in that direction are things I'm drawn to pretty much no matter what. Though it's not my favorite by Mandiko. I mean, he's one of the most exciting directors working currently for me.
See, I've just been thinking about, I've been trying to sort of put together more examples of this sort of map film that I sort of have come up with. And another one, again, it's a very sort of obscure director, because I think I've sort of talked to people about this in the past. Films like to promote conflict. Any sort of film drama usually has a lot of conflict with it, and people sort of, very famous people over time have talked about how conflict is the soul of drama. But actually, I mean, again, and this relates to another thing about film that I think people don't talk about enough, that, when people sort of are worried about there's too much sexually explicit content, but actually there's just an absurd whirlwind of violence in movies that I often think people sort of just seem to take for granted. It's part of the weather, but actually often doesn't appeal to me. Can watch very violent movies for sure, but I do sometimes worry about just the offhanded way that violence is sort of meted out in movies, particularly in revenge movies. But again, just like another movie I hit on was from very obscure, sort of forgotten now, Soviet director Mikhail Rom. So it's Rom with two M's. So he made again, and this was a movie made during the Second World War. So I don't know if there's something about times when humans were just in a very dark place and they needed to see these sort of ultra spiritual, sort of escapist movies. But he made a movie called Makta, which is Dream in English, which is just about a group of people in a Russian. Well, again, it's a boarding house. So I don't know if there's something about me and these ensemble casts in sort of these big locations. It's just a film about day-to-day hopes and dreams and what will happen to them. It's not a very organized film, and it sort of kind of ends very strangely, but it has this wonderful dreamlike, and also not very, there's no sort of violence in it. Like I say, it's quite a gentle movie, just about people's lives and their hopes and dreams, I guess. So that's another example, if anyone needed one.
Yeah, it's making me think, is that why you enjoy the Universal Soldier film? Because it kind of like just shows it in your face how violent they really are, which that's the reason why I loved it, honestly. So
I think I just like things to be explicit and to be exactly what they are. And there's almost like a sort of Manabund-esque sort of like grouping of, these ultra aggressive men that are forming some sort of cult. So I definitely, maybe we could do an entire episode on Universal Soldier Day of Reckoning. I think actually there's another Universal Soldier movie that's also pretty good that was done around the same time. But yeah, I do prefer films where they sort of wear their heart on the sleeve and, it's very clear what's going on. I guess that is also an example of, a pretty dreamlike movie. There's no suggestion whatsoever that what you're watching could, faintly be taking place in the real world.
Yeah, I think Chris might like it for that aspect, because it's very visually powerful and like ultra stylized at the same time. Especially like that huge white flashing like screen that happens like 3 times in the film. It's quite intense.
All right, you convinced me. So I'll give Universal Soldier Day of Reckoning a shot, and if I think I have enough to say about it, let's just the 3 of us and whoever else wants to join in do an episode about it. Let's get that done. So we talked about enjoying films that are just make things very, very clear, but let's see how clear we can be about our own taste. I mean, do you think that you fit into a fairly neat box where you can kind of loudly proclaim yourself to be representative of a certain cinematic subgroup? Like, for instance, Arthur, you're really into like trashy horror. Like, would you jump up and just probably proclaim that like you're in like the B-movie, trashy horror subgroup or cult movie subgroup of cinephiles? Or would you say that you don't quite fit anywhere?
I'd honestly say it's not really anywhere. I spend most of the time, and I think it just happens to everybody that does a hobby, that you find that certain group or website or something, and your taste kind of morphs into what they say are the best stuff, or at least to an extent. As I was branching out on my own, I felt like we did have an episode about that, about my hiatus, and when I came back, I felt like I was kind of done with films and I wanted to find something that is kind of outside of my box. And that ended up being action and horror films. And there are actually so many gems out there of horror films that it's just my latest obsession, I guess you could say. Just something that I want to be an expert on and kind of make a canon list, if that makes sense. Although the list I'm kind of working on now, I kind of might have to split it into 3 chapters. Like, we have the legitimately good stuff, we have the stuff that only focuses on camp, and then the so bad it's good stuff.
All right, yeah, it's going to be really interesting seeing that list. What about you, Matt? I mean, you spoke about your perfect film being about dreamers. Maybe you won't quite fit at all, but is there any of the kind of like big cinematic subgroups that you'd feel a certain kind of belonging to?
Yes, I think it's. I think I would say like movies about sort of weary dreamers. Weary, sort of gentle dreamers. I guess that's actually reminded me of another one. It's again an old black and white movie. This Brazilian movie, I think it is, Limite, by I'm going to get the name horrendously wrong. Mario Picciotto. One of the movies that the Martin Scorsese's group has managed to restore, the World Cinema Foundation. It's a movie from 1931, and it's just about a group of people who are kind of at the end of their sort of a body's ability to put up with society anymore, and a lot of their sort of wanderings that are fairly sort of dreamlike and unstructured. Also, again, there's another one that occurs to me by Jeanne. So again, a black and white movie, this time from the 20s, called Six et demi 11. So I don't, I'm not sure if there's another person who has that same niche as me. And I mean, one of the reasons that I went online was that I felt, I want to talk about films and I want to talk to people who have sort of very similar taste to me, as well as obviously dissenting views. You learn a lot from dissent, but I don't think I ever really found it. And there's the bizarre anecdote where I found someone on IMDb, and I looked at one of their lists of their favorite films, and I thought, wow, that's astonishingly similar to mine. I must speak to this person. And I sent them a mail. They weren't someone who was actually active on the forums. It was just a list that I saw, and literally a week after I sent them this private message, they deleted their entire account. So I don't know what on earth that says about people that have similar sort of taste to me, and maybe the individual was incredibly shy, but I literally said it was just very simple stuff about, we seem to have very similar taste. Do you fancy a chat? And then they immediately deleted their account because they got asked about that. I'm just trying to think about groups of interest that I might fall into.
Stop driving people away, Matt.
Yeah, exactly. Putting people off cinema for the last 20 years. But in terms of groups, like, I just can't really think of. I know that my favorite genre is thriller. Again, I never really felt that there was a thriller community, or that it was very interesting in that, great thrillers make themselves very apparent. There aren't a load of hidden amazing thrillers. Everyone sort of knows what they are and watch them all. I have got very interested in kind of British experimental cinema, avant-garde cinema, but again, that group of people is probably mostly limited to the filmmakers that actually make the films, and they're all sort of probably in some similar area of London, hanging out at the National Film Theatre. So yeah, I guess I don't really feel that I've ever could fit myself into a niche. There's definitely, I guess fellow travelers. I guess like I can think of maybe people who, I felt quite close to over the years. So, the user on ICM forum called Perception the Ambiguity, who's always been a massive member of the community. He's never been on this podcast, and I know he's a very private person, so I don't know if he ever would come on. But I do remember a conversation with him where he referred to society's mass psychosis, which he just sees as the natural state of society is mass psychosis. And, whilst that may appear to be a sort of strange view, that was something that I also completely associated with. So I think when we were talking earlier, you were talking about developments in society needing to be reflected in the movies, people's sexual preferences, for example, that, had been sort of stamped on, those identities needed to make themselves present. But I just think that there are things that go on, should I say, that for me are much larger and more disruptive than that. And I tend to view sort of society as pretty chaotic and mass psychotic. And he was someone that I had a conversation with, and he believes the same thing as me. So I don't know if that means that we're sort of two members of a very small lunatic asylum, or we're people that have gained some sort of insight. Who knows? I don't know if that's a good answer. I can't really pick a genre or a type of way of seeing cinema, a type of group that I'm fitting into.
Yeah, I did notice for at least one technical aspect that I'm appreciating editing a lot more. Like you mentioned Epstein, the editing is absolutely ridiculous in a good way for his films. Another example of that too would be the 20s Industrial Revolution, the USSR. Pretty much all of their films are editing focused and are absolutely just bewildered watching them. I really love them, and it is kind of diverting towards it, but there was even during the Industrial Revolution, because we're talking about societal connections with that, there was a composer, Arseny Avramov, and he did a piece called Symphony of Sirens, and it was literally him using battleships and factory sirens and stuff like that to make his music, and it was really just a huge military parade during then, and that would have been a kind of a cool thing to see.
I think that it's this thing that sort of Soviet cinema seemed to be very good at, that didn't travel. I don't know if you've seen, when Slavko Vorkapich went to Hollywood, the sort of, he was being sort of called in to do all this sort of fancy montage and editing, and quite often all of his sort of techniques and changes were rejected. And if you actually watch the release version of films that he was involved with, pretty dire, because none of his ability shone through. But there are some box sets that you can get hold of experimental movies where they just show you what his capabilities were when they were applied, just absolutely incredible editing work that Hollywood just wasn't happy showing. They just thought that the viewer would throw their hands up in disgust if that was in the cinema.
Yeah, I imagine as the film Seconds might have had that reaction, especially with the opening, how it was edited. I'm kind of surprised that Hollywood had something like that.
Yeah, I guess that's an era where it's tending towards more liberalization to sort of new cinema, I guess. But that's a movie that I absolutely love as well. It's one that I haven't seen for a long time, but it's pretty beautiful.
Yeah, absolutely agreed on Seconds. In terms of which box I would fit into, I mean, I think I fit into quite a few, but usually the group that I feel the most affinity with, and which I'm usually the most drawn to hearing opinions from, are the general art house group. And I actually thought you might say that you were in the art house group as well, Matt, because I always feel we have a certain degree, even if we watch films for different reasons, and we're often, liking very different films, I feel you and, there's a subgroup on the forum that are interested in films that go beyond the traditional narrative and are interested in different things. And that's usually the community and subgroup that I feel most drawn to. But like I said, I love The Godfather as well. I mean, I like both Barbie and Oppenheimer. I love a lot of classic Hollywood films too. But I do think that when I look at my all-time favorites and also the kind of films I'm most excited about exploring, there usually a very large number of them, a very disproportionate number of them could be called art house in one way or another, be they surreal, minimalist, Brechtian, or so on. Like, I think that's where a huge amount of my focus is, and I definitely feel a certain degree of affinity towards that subgroup, even though there's so many different types of art house viewers and so many different types of styles and interests, etc. It's a huge subgroup, but I think that even though I don't fit fully in that box, and I love lots of other things, I think that's the box I'm closest to, and where I probably would have to check the box if there was like a multiple choice option.
I mean, I think what you said there resonated with me, Chris, when you said that there was a lot of different types of art house viewers. So definitely, if it can be described as a genre, I don't know if it is a genre, but whatever type of grouping it is, art house almost always does appeal to me. But I have often found, like I felt you were talking more about a sort of like a social grouping, like obviously a lot of horror fans go to Fright Fest or whatever, and they will very much be liking the same sort of things usually, that they might get very excited about particular sort of gore effects or whatever. But it's felt to me like art house is a bit more of a heterogeneous group, like I imagine a lot of people listening to this have will have decided that I'm a crank, and so maybe I am, maybe there's a lot of people who are a bit sort of cranky or a bit sort of different in what who watch art house movies. And I think in terms of trying to meet up with people who also like that sort of cinema, in the UK, I found very difficult. It's very hard to sort of converse or to, that it just seems harder than if I was a pure genre fan. I think like online spaces, I think the Criterion Forum is a very sort of famous place where people sort of talk about movies, but I've never really managed to get going on, deep conversations about particular movies. So I guess you're right. It's definitely an area of cinema that I'm incredibly interested in, but I don't know if I've ever felt sort of part of a community of people that are interested in, albeit when we've done sort of programming for our sort of online film festival. I do have an affinity with yourself and with Peter in terms of programming taste, and I obviously love coming on this podcast and having sort of in-depth chats about these types of movies when we are having chats about these types of movies. But I guess that's why it didn't immediately occur to me. It's just that it's not essentially a social group that I've ever felt part of.
Well, yeah, fair enough. I mean, I think there are obviously art house festivals. Like some people will say Cannes or Berlinale is mainly art house as well. I mean, it's not, but there are different groupings where people go and they very much like the similar types of films. And I mean, we don't have we have Arthur here, but we don't have most of the horror groups. Like we have Saul, we have Tom. I think Ben and Wayne are both into horror as well, especially Wayne. So I think they would come and tell you that there are lots of different subgroups within horror fans as well. They're not all going to go to Fright Fest and like the same thing. Like you have the people who love gore, you have people who like more elevated horror, people who think that the idea of elevated horror is absolutely ridiculous term that's denigrating the entire art form of horror. You have people like Arthur who's more into B horror. There's a very, very broad spectrum of horror fans with very different interests and tastes too, I think. So and I think it's mostly just that you might not be, like, since you're not that into horror, you're not speaking with the horror fans, and their tastes might go a bit together. I think a lot of the same way people will be saying the same thing about like the art house subsection, like, oh, all of you guys just love John Dielman, all of you guys loved sci, all of you guys love like anything that's minimalist or experimental, you guys are gonna love. But there's like obviously people who in the art house sphere who doesn't like Ackerman, or who doesn't like Godard, or who doesn't like, there's a huge amount of variety there as well. Some will be mainly towards realism, some will be mainly towards minimalism, some will be more towards very specific types of expression or meaning or interpretations as well. Everyone knows that Bergman hated Godard, for instance. So I think that no matter what group you look at, you're gonna find a lot of diversity.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I mean, I'm sort of hyper aware of the fact that with horror, horror is a very personal thing. For if you are a practicing Catholic and you deeply believe in it and you watch The Exorcist, you're absolutely scared witless. Whereas, if you're sort of atheist or agnostic or, Buddhist or whatever, you watch it and it's almost like you're watching a comedy. And I get that there are very many different types of horror movies and, various different dimensionalities of that. I guess I don't know what I was exactly trying to say, whereas some of it's about interpretation. How wide would the sort of spectrum of interpretation on a particular horror movie be, or whether it was about the who are we talking about when we talk about the fan base? Because I went to an art house festival recently. There's one in my hometown. It's called Cinema Revisited. It's an absolutely excellent festival, retrospective sort of art house festival that goes over 5 days. And I think when I tended to meet people there, it is quite hard to meet people. It's quite hard to talk to people. And a lot of them are very involved in film, like they are film producers, or they are film curators, or they're, people that are trying to get into the film industry. Whereas maybe if you meet a bunch of horror people, they're much more sort of fit into, this is a fan group, and, these are people that maybe it's easier to hang out with and have a drink with. Whereas the art house group, where they're talking to people, it is kind of work as well, in a way, if they're trying to network and things like that. So I don't know. It may just be exactly like you say, that there are a wide range of different types of horror fans and art house fans, and the discussions are just as diverse in each group. And I mean, I did have thoughts about that recently. Pauline Kael sort of had written this article talking about how types of movies were tribal, and there are some tribes that like to turn up to a movie and almost be in pain and have a bad experience, and it's almost like an endurance test, and that's almost their tribe, and it's almost like arbitrary. It could be anything, and then there's the tribe that likes to watch fantasy movies or whatever. So you could just be completely right that it's just different tribes, and there's no real difference other than tribal loyalty going on.
Yeah, with horror films, especially like even just so bad it's good stuff in general, I find that a social gathering kind of thing makes more sense with that. A lot of them just are in the couch together having a bunch of beers, or we smoke weed or something, and they all just laugh at the film or comment at the illogical parts of it. But kind of a funny story, because like we mentioned before, I also do like the more investigative aspect of films, but I want to find like people to talk to about horror films. So I found a Discord server that's just like horror in general, and then within like an hour of me being there, they start talking about torture porn, which I don't really like the genre, but they're saying like, oh, what was the point about this movement? I don't see anything good about it. And then I jumped in and said, well, I saw an interview with Eli Roth, and he said that this was the response because of how scared everyone was during the war in Iraq with 9/11 and all the terrorist attacks, and then how the other side was treated at the same time too. They all went hog wild at me. They're saying like that analysis makes no sense and you're pretentious for thinking that. So it can kind of work both ways if it's tribalism.
I mean, I think what you're saying is perfectly reasonable there. I hadn't necessarily collected the dots on there, but I think you're right. And I mean, like those sort of like horror movies that we call torture porn, like often have felt just absolutely intensely uncomfortable watching them. Not necessarily because, what's on screen is scaring me, but I also sat there sort of judging myself like, why are you watching this? Why are you watching someone being torn apart, and what does that say about you? Whereas actually, I mean, I'm just thinking about, I think this was Eli Roth. Is it Hostel Part 2? Is that Eli? Yeah, it is. It is Eli Roth. I remember watching Hostel 2 and just thinking it was an absolutely incredible movie and just absolutely shook me up in the cinema. But then I was a bit sort of ashamed of having felt like that. But it definitely, like you say, was a time where society had been spent a lot of time talking about Guantanamo and Abu Ghraib, and things are allowed to happen. And I definitely sort of think what you say sounds very reasonable. But it is also, like you say, that, I mean, again, this is something like one of the reasons that I watch movies is that I do kind of think that there are a lot of unspoken things about the way people interact. And if you ask that sort of horror group, what is this group about? They'd probably say a load of stuff that sort of put it in a good light. But then what it's really about is some sort of stratified hierarchical structure, and you've come in there and said something a bit different, and it's reacted against that, and maybe that's more of the truth of the structure, I guess. So I can just segue into sort of different point I make, about this sort of investigation aspect that I like about things. Yeah, maybe we need to do an episode about torture porn.
I would not be part of that one. I can't stand it, but you'd probably be able to get the horror fans involved in that one for sure. So that would always be an interesting question itself to see like what limits we have. Like I don't watch torture porn. Like I just can't stand that sort of thing. We already mentioned you having like this several ethical dilemmas with films as well. But I think we've been talking for a very, very long time here now. So I think we can move towards just wrapping this one up. And I have one last kind of semi-fun question, because it's happened to me quite a few times. And it kind of illustrates the power of taste and how different we are from each other. So I'd love to hear, have either of you ever been in a situation where you've been talking to someone or you've been reading someone's reviews and they're talking about how much they liked or disliked a film, but all of the words they're using, all of the ways they're describing it to you, that sounds like what you would say if you were either trashing it or raving about it. So essentially, this person has seen this film through completely different eyes, or exact same eyes, describing it exactly as you would, but their meanings, the words they use, instead they have the inverted meaning of how you think.
So Chris, this image of you as this cold, unflappable film fan has suddenly dissolved into nothing with your statements about torture porn, potentially. But I leave that hanging there. But when I'll answer the question that you asked. I can't think of a particular incidence of that happening, although it has happened. But I am very interested in movie reviews and the way that movie reviews should be written. And what I like to say about a well-written movie review is that, if you put a star rating on it between sort of 1 and 10 or 1 and 5 or 0.5 or however you do that, and whatever your overall view is that, I'm really happy that I saw this film, someone should be able to read your review and discern whether they would like it. And an absolute ideal result for me is if I will write a review of a movie that I really like, and if someone can tell that they 100% would not like it, like, to me that's a success, and that's something that's very hard to do with review writing. So it has happened to me. I can't unfortunately think of any examples, but I do think that is, I think that is when people are being eloquent, if they can get across a sense of the movie to you, even though you'd completely disagree about whether the movie was a great movie or a terrible one.
We actually had an episode entirely about how to write a review, and I think that's the conclusion we came to as well. Like, that would be the ideal review, if you can read it, and no matter the opinion of the reviewer, they would be describing it so well that you'd really be able to guess if you'd like it or not. So very, very well put. What about you, Arthur? Have you ever been in this kind of situation where someone is talking about the film? Maybe since you're really into B movies, they might be describing how ridiculous something is, or how bad the acting is, how over the top it was, and you're sitting there thinking, wow, everything you're saying right now sounds awesome.
For B movies, when they just talk about how illogical everything is, or they just describe a scene saying like, what the fuck is actually going on with this, that piques my interest. For the more art house type of films, usually if there's like these really like amateur, like poorly done reviews, they say like, oh, this is pretentious, or oh, this is style over substance. I usually want to see it at that point.
I often feel the same way. Yeah, if someone says this is style over substance, I think, oh wow, they really went all in, because to me, style very often is substance, like form, the way films move, etc. That's a huge part of what I enjoy. So I'll definitely agree with you there. And I think I don't remember any absolute exact instances where it's one film, but I know a lot of times when people have been talking about the film, talking about, oh, this is such a misanthropic film, it's such an ugly view of society, like it's so cold and unrelenting. I kind of like sit up like, ooh, tell me more. Or if someone goes, and this movie is so artificial, so fake, so over the top, and like those types of things. Like if you mention the word artificiality, I'll start peeking up my ears as well. Definitely. So it does happen to me. So if people use some of those buzzwords, I will look into it. And yeah, even just like throwaway words like boring and pretentious, if it comes from a certain area, I might be interested as well. Though not as much as if someone says, oh, this is cold and unrelenting and misanthropic. I've gotten more happy and positive, I suppose, later in life, because I used to be really, really drawn to coldness and misanthropy. Now I don't seek that out specifically, but I still really, really enjoy those dark films. I like films that evoke emotion from really dark places and go there.
Yeah, it's kind of the same for me. Like, it's more evolving taste, but in my 20s, I was like the anti-people nihilist. So I totally get where you're coming from.
I think a lot of people might have gone through that in their 20s. And I mean, actually, when we were talking about the Manuel Knapp films, and you pointed out, oh, there aren't any sort of people in them, and so they're a bit sort of anti-people. That's probably why I was drawn to them at the time. And you're just sort of living at a difficult point in your life where you don't really feel that you sort of have a place or sort of niche in society, and you get sort of treated quite roughly because of that. So that's probably something for me. I do actually think of a time where I went to see a film because someone told me it was incredibly disappointing. I thought of one, and it was Lars von Trier's Nymphomaniac. So I think when I'd seen all the marketing for the movie, the marketing, I think, was pretty misleading. That it was almost like it was some sort of Tinto Brass type movie that Lars von Trier had just made this sort of hyper pornographic movie. And I thought, I'm not particularly interested in that. And then someone from work who thought it would be that went to see it, and then they came back and said, oh, it's an absolutely terrible movie. It wasn't sexy at all. And I thought, all right, I've got to go and see that now. And it did end up being like, it is one of those movies, Chris, actually. Like, I don't know if you would comment about it, and I'm referring to it as a movie because I watched it all as one movie. It was presented like that in some cinemas that is showing a side of sexual desire sometimes that's really sort of depressing, or there even if it's not about sex, there are some bits in the movie, someone's dying of cancer, or this amazing scene of confrontation where a woman and her children turn up at the apartment of her husband and mistress, and they have this sort of massive argument which has this amazing cold humor to it. But I don't know if that's one from your sort of cold side that you'd been interested in.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, Lars von Trier was one of those big directors I fell in love with when I was getting into cinema, for sure. And I like those really dark misanthropic films. And Lars von Trier is like a darkly comedic. You take pleasure in it, essentially, going into these dark, deprived places. Yeah, that's especially when I was a teenager and early 20s. That was somewhere I would seek out quite a lot. And I think this is actually a perfect place to end the episode, because we were talking about places we were in our lives and at times we were drawn to something different, and that's actually going to be the point of an episode we'll be doing very, very soon. It's going to be about evolving your taste and or how our tastes evolved over time. And we're going to explore whether or not we're all destined to become film snobs when we go older, or be pushed into extreme corners, or just where we land and where we've been and where we've gone to. So that should be a really fun companion episode for anyone who enjoyed this one. So until next time, thank you so much for listening, and join us again soon. You have been listening to Talking Images, the official podcast of icmforum.com.